I'm Anne Westcott. I'm one of the founding partners of SMARTmoves, and we, along with Liz Warner, Alex Cook, and Heather Finn, developed sensory motor arousal treatment for children. And so today's talk is going to be on the role of rhythms and rhythmicity in trauma work. And at this point, I would predominantly SMART was developed as a child treatment model initially, and we're exploring it now with adults, younger ones, pregnant and parenting adults. So it's kind of growing. And today, I'm just going to share my screen to keep me on schedule. Today, we are going to look at rhythms. A lot of our approach in SMART, it's basically we look at three different threads of the work, and we think of ourselves as a component-based treatment, meaning you might be at any of the three threads: somatic regulation, trauma processing, and attachment building. As we work with those three different threads, we tend to see the child's window of tolerance widening, and the child getting less dysregulated by some of the same stimulus. That's like the model presentation. But today, what I want to look at is the role of rhythms in all three threads. Very briefly, share a little bit of material with you and a few exercises you might do, and just see what the impact of rhythms is on you. If you were with us earlier, you were introduced to the hierarchy of development. This is, we're going to focus today on these bottom two developmental levels: the sensory processing foundation and physiological regulation and rhythmicity. So basically, what we think about when we are looking at rhythms at this level is when we were developing SMART with children and youth and families, we began to focus our intention on building rhythms of engagement between the child and caregiver in the room. However, as we watched a lot of film, and Dr. Warner and her colleague were looking at some of the film and doing some coding research, we were starting to see these patterns show up about how the rhythms of relational engagement were grounded in the rhythms of the sensory and motor play system of the child. And so we started to look at how the therapeutic process of rhythms could promote attachment building in a very dynamic, full body engagement between the adult and the child in the room. So prior to thinking about rhythms of engagement for attachment, we began to start to look at physiological regulation and rhythmicity just naturally occurring in the child's nervous system and in their play in the SMART room. And the beauty of this play was it didn't require language, symbolic thinking, receptive or expressive language. It actually started to engage the full body and bottom up parts of our nervous system for connection and communication that are nonverbal. And for many of you and all of us who work with trauma, we know that verbal interventions sometimes need a complement or need a bottom-up intervention to support engagement of the whole brain. So our rhythms and rhythmicity start to engage the amygdala as well as the hypothalamus and the, oops, my eyes can't read, and the medial dorsal thalamus. And so these are really lower brain structures. Here we go. In addition, because we're engaging the sensory systems, we're also engaging the brainstem and the cerebellum. So when we're working with rhythms, we're creating some activation and coordination in these lower brain centers. So we're going to look first at what rhythms do for regulating. And I'm hoping you all are somewhere where you could experiment with making a rhythm using your body in the room you're in. So I have a rhythm of just catching and tossing. I'm going to stop share for a sec. So I'm just playing with catching and tossing. But perhaps you could make a rhythm in your office by a drumming on your body, or up and down with your feet, or perhaps you could make a rhythm by marching. So everybody take a second and create a rhythm using your body. And let me know, describe a little bit what you did and what you noticed when you pause. You can do that in the chat if you have a second. So what happens for us in the Smart Room is we start to see children using our tools and equipment who organically begin to find rhythms in the room. So one piece of audio I'm going to play for you actually shows a child and her therapist. Hold on a sec, stop share. And they're sitting across from each other and they're using a little peanut ball like this, and they're just bouncing it. And as you watch it, you'll see that they'll bounce it towards each other and back. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to play for you actually, the rhythm of this, and I want you to just listen. There. So you could feel that very steady rhythm that the child had going. It's actually like a 16-year-old teenager with a pretty significant trauma history. And they were enjoying yeah.
It didn't play for some reason. I wonder if it filtered it out. Maybe if you try and share your screen and play it, it'll
oh, okay.
Filter it out this time.
Oh, hold on a sec. I didn't share audio. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's see if this works.
That's a really cool thing to have. What a great skill. Okay, so yes.
Patrick, did that work?
Yes, it did. Yeah, that came through well.
Great. Great. So as you heard that, you could hear the steady rhythm that the teenager was making with the peanut ball. What was very interesting about that is the peanut ball right at the end went a little chaotic, and it actually hit the therapist unexpectedly, not in any way that was harmful, but it startled the therapist. And the youngster, who's 17, ended up collapsing and going into hypoarousal, given her trauma history. And one of the pieces that's very powerful about this is the auditory that we have. Hang on. One second. Patrick, can you hear that?
Yes, that's playing.
Okay. So over time, after about 20 minutes of sitting, the therapist ended up singing to the youngster who was in a hypoaroused dorsal vagal state. Introducing rhythm again. And as this singing happened, then the youngster started to peek out at the therapist and stick her tongue out. And they ended up playing a back and forth tongue game, mirroring each other rhythmically during the silence. And then the client slowly came out of the dorsal vagal state. And then the two of them began a rhythm game. In the background noise you hear, is the residents outside of the room. However, one of the pieces for this youngster in that hypoaroused state was that these very simple nonverbal rhythms began to bring her back out into being able to connect with the therapist very slowly. And I regret that I can't show the visual on that tape, but because it's confidential information, we can't have it recorded, and because it's a client treatment. If you saw the tape, you would see the youngster just lying in a cushion with some weighted blankets over her and the therapist sitting there for 20 minutes. And then this song came, and then this rhythms between the two of them started to emerge. So when we're thinking about rhythms of connection between the therapist, we're also thinking about rhythms of connection for the child with themselves. So when we're working with rhythms in treatment, sometimes we might be introducing a rhythm, but more often than not, we started to notice the child engaging in a rhythm of their own. And then the therapist will begin to catch and mirror the rhythm back in order to begin to build that connection between first self and then self and others. This starts to really kind of land very much on the serve and return rhythms that we know that support child development and social, motor, behavioral, and language capacities in children. So I have another clinical case that I want to talk about. So this youngster that I came in was very out of sync with others. She was quite internal. She had a tremendous amount of trauma early on. She was placed, she was in the hospital a lot for the first 9 months due to failure to thrive. She had a feeding tube installed. She was then placed with foster family because her parents were unable to manage her medical needs and the neglect was too difficult. She's now with a permanent family and they're working with me. And she's come in and she started to play a lot of her games with no interaction with the parent and I who were in the room. And one of her favorite things was to jump on our trampoline and dive into the crash cushions. And as I watched her do this over and over again, she had an internal rhythm to herself. And I was thinking to myself, how could we begin to make her become aware that the two adults, her mother, her adoptive mom or her adoptive dad, they took turns each week, were in the room? How could she begin to incorporate them in order to get this serve and return going, which was really obviously absent? So as she was playing her game, I actually put two of these together. These are what we use for balancing. If you saw the vestibular talk last week. And she had her cushion. And I just took it. And as she was getting ready, I started to bring it up so that she was now having to relate to her dad and I as she prepared to dive over the cushions and onto the floor. So her dad was on the one side and then I was on the other. And what started to happen is we began to move it up and down in a very rhythmic and predictable way. And this rhythm became something where she started to plan her movements in rhythm with our movements. And we could see the rhythmicity at the motor and the sensory level coming on board as she mastered that very quickly because she was quite physically capable. She started to instruct us how fast and slow to move it up. And at times you could see her purposefully interrupting the rhythm and crashing and breaking these so that they collapsed. And she would then repair them and bring them back to us and have us repeat. And this game she's been playing now for maybe 4 or 5 weeks. She plays it with each caregiver each week who comes in. And one of the biggest pieces, as the caregivers are getting a little bored of the game, what we're really seeing is how she's at a motor level, she's kind of enacting and embodying and communicating her trauma experience of constant disruption, getting a little bit of a rhythm with a caregiver, disruption, rhythm, disruption. So it's been really interesting to watch as she's enjoying and mastering, finding connection with both of us. So that's a really good clinical example of how we're using rhythms to support first the child finding predictability within themselves, and then the child beginning to find predictability in connection with others, and being able to change or interrupt or break rhythm, and that important aspect of regaining it so that we're not looking at sustaining it. Sometimes the child needs to adjust it a little and make it more fun and creative or add a new rhythm to the existing game. So rhythms become like this background in the clinical sessions that when we're focused more on the narrative or the relationship, we can lose awareness of how these sensory and motor rhythms become so important for creating that predictability, arousal regulation, beginning to develop that physiological ability to coordinate their bodies and feeling the tempo together, getting into the groove with each other in a non-thinking, non-language-based being in sync. So if we circle back for a second, part of rhythms really begin to help engage regulation for the child, engage ways to motorically get attached and build attachment capacity with others. And in the case I just explained, it helps them sometimes convey when predictability gets disrupted, to convey their traumatic experience. I realize that's 4:21. Let me see. I think that's all the different things I have here for us to work with right now. I have a drum. We do some drumming with kids. Kids will often play our Bosu ball. They'll play these big physio balls. These will become a really major bouncing activity. There's a lot of bouncing and catching and getting a rhythm between therapist and child, therapist and adult or caregiver and child. So I'm thinking about too, for those of you working more with adults, I think that I have done less bringing rhythms in as easily with adults. I do with a lot of my teenagers, are really comfortable with it. I think the rhythms that I do the most with adults will be a ball toss, back and forth catch. Some adults have really enjoyed like the rhythm of the rocking chair and the rhythm of the aerial hammock that gives them a back and forth. I've also used the tappers a lot for the bilateral rhythms. This really helps several of my clients be able to stay more emotionally regulated while doing maybe narrating difficult experiences. So I hope that gives you some ideas about how to bring rhythms in. And I think that's all I have for you today, so we could take some questions.
All right. Thank you, Anne. All right. So we do have two questions here in the chat, and I'm sure some more will roll in soon. First one is, can you say what modes generally work well with teens?
Most of my teens somehow love the physio ball. They'll sit on it, they'll roll on it. They're much more comfortable with that. They also have seemed fine with playing catch. So I might just, hey, why don't we toss the ball while we're talking? I did a lot of home-based work, so I would often be at the park with kids. Anytime you can do something physical that has a rhythm with teenagers, it felt like it was so much easier for them to be in their bodies and be connected. Even like they'll just sit there and tap. They're making a rhythm for themselves, and that's to be encouraged in my mind and supported, and maybe even explored how it's helpful.
That kind of leads into the next question. What are tappers? I think you've sort of just explained it. If you've ever been in a high school, you probably know what that is, but go for it, Anne.
Well, there's also these things, I forget who sells them on the web. I got them at one of the conferences. They're bilateral tappers, and you hold them in your hand, and they have a little app on your phone, and they just buzz right and left. And the person can set the pace. You can set it strong or weaker, and you can set it faster or slower. And it literally just gives them bilateral stimulation, kind of like the bilateral headset with the music that it does it. So I've had kids put them in their pockets or put them so they can feel it, or one kid put them in their socks. And that, like, he would just have them going through the session. And I had an adult use them. And then they also have like watch straps, so you could strap them to your hands. And I thought it was really interesting because the adult was doing some processing with me, and all of a sudden, I didn't know it, but the tappers had gone off, and all of a sudden her emotion just flew and got really strong. And then she said, hey, can you put the tappers back on, because they just stopped. And it was really useful to see how much her regulation, her affect regulation and arousal regulation shifted without the tappers. So I think I can find a resource and give it to you, Pat, or we can look online.
Okay.
I think they're called like BiTap.
This is more of a comment, but I'll read it anyway. That was so great to learn about. The example with the child you shared is really amazing, and I'm learning a lot about what this can do. Coordinating their own bodies, getting in the groove with others, ways they can add to their own story. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's nice to get feedback.
Can you give an example of what a tapping is? Someone is asking.
Well, there's tapping that you can just do yourself. Literally, I just got these BiTaps. They're these tiny little things that clip. They were just super simple, and I was really struck at how easy they were to use. And the kids and the teenagers liked them because they were gadgets, and they like gadgets. And they like controlling and finding out what their body's like, just the speed, the pace. Yeah, I had one client get them for home because she liked them so much. They were so helpful. So Alex is going to be back talking about all the ways that SMART promotes attachment building. So she's really going to add to the ways rhythm promotes attachment building. She's going to look at other tools in SMART, safe space, some of the therapist skills we use that promote regulate attachment building capacity.